He said it while carving the roast. The knife moved cleanly through the meat, steady, practiced. His children were seated to his left. His wife stood near the island refilling glasses. The dining room lights were warm, almost theatrical, casting a soft amber over the table. And then, with a laugh that carried just enough volume to draw the attention of everyone present, my son told his guest that I had never amounted to much. One of the boys had asked what I used to do for work. It was an innocent question. Children have a way of asking directly what adults avoid. Before I could answer, he did. "Oh, Grandpa tried a few things," he said, smiling thinly. "Nothing that really worked." There was a pause, a ripple of polite laughter from his friends, a glance exchanged between his wife and the couple seated across from them. He lifted his glass slightly, as if to punctuate the joke. "He always meant well," he added, "just never had the instincts." Failure. He did not use the word immediately. He allowed it to hang in implication first. Then, as if worried the message might be too subtle, he clarified. "Some people just aren't built for success." That was when I placed my fork down, not abruptly, not with force. I aligned it carefully against the plate. The clink was soft, almost delicate. I folded my napkin once, twice, and set it beside the glass. The children were watching me now. Their faces were unguarded, curious. They were learning something in that moment. I wanted them to learn correctly. If you are listening to this story, take a moment now to subscribe. Let me know in the comments what time it is and where you're watching from. I find it grounding to remember that dignity travels farther than humiliation. Now back to that table. I did not correct him. Not there, not in front of his guests. I did not remind him who wired the down payment on that house. I did not mention the private school invoices that were paid each quarter without fail. I did not bring up the graduate loans that quietly disappeared from his credit report 5 years earlier. Silence, when chosen deliberately, is not weakness. It is control. I looked at my grandson and answered his question instead. I worked in structured finance. I said calmly, I help companies understand contracts. It was precise. It was sufficient. My son gave a dismissive shrug. Consulting? Nothing glamorous. The irony did not escape me. His own firm existed only because I had underwritten its first 2 years of operating losses. I had signed as guarantor on a line of credit he would not have qualified for independently. The revolving facility was secured not by projections, but by my balance sheet. I stayed another 12 minutes, long enough to finish the glass of water in front of me, long enough to observe the room settle back into conversation. When I stood, I did so quietly. "I have an early morning," I said. He did not walk me to the door. The October air outside was sharp, cleaner than the air inside the house. I stood on the front step for a moment before descending. The exterior lights illuminated the brick facade I had helped him acquire. I remembered the closing date, April 14th. I remembered the transfer confirmation, $280,000, labeled as family support loan conditional. Conditional. The word mattered. Over the years, I had learned that generosity without structure breeds distortion. I had structured every substantial transfer, not because I anticipated betrayal, but because I understood human nature. Informality erodes memory. Documentation preserves clarity. The tuition payments of children were disbursed through a trust established 6 years prior. The trust instrument contained conduct provisions. They were not theatrical morality clauses. They were straightforward expectations regarding reputational harm, material misrepresentation, and public conduct that could reasonably impair the integrity of the grantor. I was the grantor. The business credit guarantee was tied performance benchmarks and quarterly reporting covenants. Failure to maintain compliance allowed for discretionary withdrawal. He had never asked to read the underlying language. He trusted momentum more than structure. That evening, I did not act in anger. I drove home. My house was smaller, older, paid for in full. I unlocked the front door and stepped into a space that had not required anyone else's approval. The rooms were quiet. There is a particular silence that accompanies self-sufficiency. It is not lonely. It is clean. I went to my study. The desk was organized as it had been for years. Files labeled by date. Digital backups mirrored to physical copies. I removed the folder marked Family Transfers. Inside were copies of wire confirmations, trust documents, promissory notes, and the business credit agreement. I did not open them immediately. Instead, I poured a single glass of water and sat down. The humiliation at the table was not loud in my mind. It was measured. He had not shouted. He had not insulted me directly. He had done something subtler. He had attempted to redefine history in front of his children. That is a different offense. Children accept narratives as truth. If I allowed his version to calcify, it would not simply diminish me. It would distort the foundation on which those children understood responsibility, effort, and consequence. I opened the first document. The promissory note for the down payment was clear. It specified that the principal was interest-free so long as the borrower maintained good faith conduct and non-disparagement of the lender in public or private settings where reputational harm may reasonably arise. The language was deliberate, drafted by a colleague who specialized in contingency structures for family-held enterprises. At the time, my son had laughed at the formality. "You don't trust me?" he had asked. "I trust documentation," I replied. He had signed without reading closely. I reviewed the trust instrument next. Section 4.2 allowed the trustee me to suspend discretionary distributions upon evidence of conduct materially adverse to the grantor's standing or dignity within familial and social contexts. The phrasing had seemed almost excessive when written. Now it felt prescient. I closed the folder and leaned back. The night was quiet. No raised voices. No dramatic declarations. The only sound was the hum of the desk lamp. I did not draft emails that evening. I did not call attorneys in outrage. Retaliation, when impulsive, weakens position. Instead, I began assembling a timeline. Dates of transfers. Dates of compliance reports. Notes from prior conversations where he had dismissed oversight as unnecessary. There's power in chronology. It reveals patterns without accusation. The following morning at 7:12 a.m., I sent a single email to the trustee administrator requesting a routine review of disbursements. Neutral language. No emotion. At 8:03 a.m., I contacted the bank officer who managed the credit guarantee, requesting updated performance metrics under the existing covenants. These were procedural steps, entirely permissible, entirely defensible. I did not mention the dinner. Consequence does not require confession. It requires structure. By the end of that week, reports began arriving. The consulting firm had missed 2 minor reporting deadlines in the previous quarter. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to trigger formal inquiry under the agreement. The school tuition disbursement for the next term was scheduled in 30 days. Suspension required only written notice. I signed nothing yet. I waited. Waiting clarifies intention. If anger were driving me, it would fade or intensify unpredictably. Instead, what remained was not anger. It was clarity. A father is not obligated to finance contempt. 3 weeks later, the first subtle tremor occurred. The bank sent a routine compliance notice to his office. He called me that afternoon. "Did you request this?" he asked, tone controlled but tight. "I requested updated information." I replied, "Standard practice." There was a pause. "You don't have to make everything so formal," he said. "I disagree." He exhaled audibly. "This feels unnecessary." "Documentation often does," I said, "until it doesn't." We ended the call without resolution. At that moment, nothing dramatic had happened. No payments had been canceled. No declarations made. The house still stood. The children still attended school. The business still operated. But the architecture beneath his assumptions had shifted. He had called me a failure in front of his children. What he did not understand yet was that I do not respond to insult with argument. I respond with structure. The tuition payment was due on November 3rd at 9 a.m. I know that because I built the schedule myself. 6 years earlier, when my eldest grandson was accepted into Hawthorne Preparatory, the headmaster had emphasized punctuality. "Our institution relies on families who understand commitment," he said. I assured him that commitment would not be an issue. I did not elaborate that the funds would originate from a trust structured with layered contingencies and quarterly review triggers. Most schools prefer optimism to transparency. The tuition was not a gift. It was a discretionary educational distribution from the Marlowe Family Trust, established June 18th at 2:14 p.m., notarized in my former colleague's office overlooking State Street. The trust existed for the benefit of my grandchildren, not their parents. That distinction mattered more than anyone acknowledged at the time. On October 19th, at precisely 8:47 a.m., I drafted the notice of temporary suspension. The language was measured. Pursuant to Section 4.2b, discretionary distributions are hereby paused pending review of grammar-impacting conduct materially adverse to fiduciary standing. No accusation, no emotional phrasing, just citation and action. I read it 3 times before sending. Suspension does not equate to termination. It creates space. It signals that something requires attention. In finance, pauses are warnings. At 9:02 a.m., the trustee administrator acknowledged receipt and confirmed procedural compliance. We will hold the November disbursement pending further instruction. I close my laptop. There is a particular stillness that follows administrative decisions. No applause, no explosion, just silence settling into place. 3 days later, my son called. They're saying the tuition didn't process. He began without greeting. Yes, I replied. A pause. Longer this time. What does that mean? It means it did not process. You know what I'm asking. I know. His breathing shifted. The sound of movement on his end, perhaps pacing. This is about dinner, he said finally. It is about conduct. I corrected. You're seriously pulling the kids into this? I am protecting the structure designed for them. That's the same thing. No, I said evenly. It is not. Silence again. Anger prefers escalation. It prefers raised voices and accusations that can be swatted down. I offered neither. You're overreacting, he said. Explain, I replied. It was a joke. In front of your children. They didn't even understand it. They understood tone. He exhaled sharply. You're being dramatic. I am being procedural. The distinction frustrated him. He wanted emotion to argue against. He received language instead. He attempted a different angle. If this is about pride, you could have just said something that night. I chose not to. So now you're just going to what? Shut everything down? I have paused the discretionary distribution, pending review. That is within my authority. You're punishing the kids. I am evaluating whether their father understands the origin of their stability. He said nothing to that. The following week, Hawthorne Preparatory sent a polite but firm reminder. Tuition was outstanding. My son forwarded the email to me without comment. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I reviewed the firm's quarterly report that had arrived from the bank. Revenue projections had been optimistic. Cash flow was thinner than he had implied at dinner when boasting to his guests. The credit line remained active, but compliance notices were now flagged. The officer handling the account had included a subtle phrase, continued guarantor participation appreciated. Participation. I placed the report beside the trust document. It is remarkable how quickly dependency becomes invisible to the dependent. He had grown accustomed to seamless support, automatic transfers, quiet guarantees, problems resolved before they reached his awareness. My silence over the years had not been weakness. It had been insulation. Now, the insulation was thinning. On October 28th, he came to my house. He did not call ahead. When I opened the door, he was standing rigidly on the porch, jaw tight, coat unbuttoned despite the cold. This is ridiculous, he said as soon as I stepped aside to let him in. I closed the door gently behind him. Small gestures matter. Slamming doors dramatize conflict. Closing them quietly controls it. Coffee. I offered. I'm not here for coffee. I am. I walked to the kitchen without waiting for permission. He followed reluctantly. The house was warm. The overhead light cast a softer glow than the bright dining room chandelier from weeks prior. Environmental contrast clarifies perspective. In his home, he had posture and audience. In mine, he had neither. I need that tuition processed, he said. You need to understand the terms under which it exists. You've never made this conditional before. I have always made it conditional. You simply never read closely. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. This is insane. You're holding money over my head because I made a joke. You publicly mischaracterized my life's work in a manner reasonably interpreted as reputationally diminishing. I said evenly. That falls within defined parameters. You're talking like I'm in court. You are in contract. His expression shifted slightly at that. Less anger, more uncertainty. You really do this? To your own son. I would do this to anyone who signed the same documents. That's not the same. It is precisely the same. He looked around the kitchen as if searching for support in the walls. The house did not respond. You know I can't just come up with $35,000 out of nowhere, he said finally. I am aware. So what's the point? To make me beg. No. Then what? To establish accuracy. He frowned. Accuracy of what? Of narrative, I said. You told your children I failed. He rolled his eyes. It wasn't that serious. It was, for you, maybe, for them. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. I poured coffee into a mug and set it on the table. The steam rose between us. Warm air meeting cooler space. Contrast again. I will review the suspension in 2 weeks. I said, if during that time you demonstrate comprehension of the agreements and their purpose, we can discuss reinstatement. That sounds like probation. It is review. You're unbelievable. On the contrary, I said quietly, I am very predictable. He left 15 minutes later, without resolution. The door closed softly behind him. That evening, I sat in the study again. I did not feel triumph, nor regret, only steadiness. Consequence, when applied without rage, carries a different weight. It is not explosive. It is gravitational. 3 days later, the firm missed payroll. I learned this not from him, but from the compliance officer, who called to inform me that the revolving credit facility had been drawn to its maximum limit. Are you comfortable continuing as guarantor under these conditions? She asked carefully. Comfortable. The word lingered. I will review the covenants. I replied. The insulation was nearly gone now. At dinner weeks earlier, he had carved roast and carved narrative with equal confidence. He believed stability was self-generated. That night had been warm, loud, and performative. Now, the air around him was colder, quieter, structural. He had called me a failure in front of his children. He was beginning to understand that infrastructure is rarely visible until it disappears. The payroll shortfall became public on a Tuesday. It was not dramatic. There were no shouting matches in the office lobby, no employees storming out, just a delayed deposit notification that failed to appear in accounts that had grown accustomed to punctuality. When predictability vanishes, even briefly, confidence follows out the door. At 10:18 a.m., the bank officer emailed to confirm that the revolving credit facility had been fully extended and was now in technical breach of the leverage covenant outlined in Section 7.3 of the guarantor agreement. The language was sterile. Immediate attention recommended. I printed the email and placed it beside the promissory note from April 14th. 2 documents. 2 pillars of the same architecture. My son called at 11:02 a.m. This is spiraling, he said without preamble. In what respect? I asked. You know exactly in what respect. The bank is questioning the guarantee. Payroll bounced. Clients are asking questions. Have you reviewed the compliance notice from last quarter? I asked calmly. That's not the issue right now. It is precisely the issue. He exhaled sharply. If you pull out now, the firm collapses. If the firm collapses because one guarantor withdraws, it was not solvent. You're doing this on purpose. I am responding to documented noncompliance. It's a bad quarter. That's it. It is 3 consecutive reporting irregularities. He went quiet at that. Silence could be more accusatory than any raised voice. You could fix this, he said finally. Yes. Then fix it. On what basis? Because I'm your son. That is not a financial covenant. The line was quiet except for his breathing. I imagined him in his office. Blinds partially drawn. Desk cluttered with invoices he had not anticipated needing to scrutinize. He had always preferred vision to detail, strategy to structure. I had built my life on the opposite. "You're punishing me," he said. "I am adjusting exposure." Exposure to what? To misjudgment. There was a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his voice when he replied. "So what now?" "Now, you provide updated financial statements, including accurate cash flow projections and outstanding liabilities. Then we evaluate. That'll take time." "Correct. And payroll is your responsibility." He ended the call without another word. That afternoon, I contacted the bank formally. Effective immediately, I am initiating review of my guarantor position under the revolving facility. I wrote, "No extension or additional draw shall be approved without my express written consent." The officer responded within minutes. "Understood. Understood." It is remarkable how quickly tone shifts when documentation moves from passive to active. 3 days later, he appeared at my office. Not my home, but the downtown suite I still maintain for advisory consultations. He had not visited there in years. The receptionist announced him cautiously, as if aware of the tension that trailed behind his name. When he entered, he looked smaller than he had at dinner. The confidence that accompanied performance had thinned. "You could have warned me," he said. "I did," I replied. "At dinner." He clenched his jaw. "This is business. That was personal. They are intertwined. You're making it that way." "No," I said evenly. "You did." He dropped a folder onto my desk. Financial statements. Not organized, not tabbed, raw printouts. Some pages missing signatures. I did not reach for them immediately. "Sit," I said. He remained standing for a moment before lowering himself into the chair across from me. "Do you know why the guarantee exists?" I asked, to help me get started. "No. It exists to stabilize risk during formative years under defined conditions. Those conditions require transparency and mutual respect." I've been transparent. You have been optimistic. That's how business works. "No," I corrected. "That is how gambling works." His eyes flashed. "You've never believed in me." I held his gaze steadily. "I believed enough to underwrite you. That's not the same as respect. Respect is earned through stewardship." He leaned back, frustration bleeding into something more fragile. "I'm trying," he said quietly. "I know." "Then why are you doing this?" "Because attempting without discipline breeds collapse. And because you attempted to rewrite my history in front of your children." He looked away at that. "It was a joke," he murmured again, but the conviction was gone. "Was it?" I asked gently. He did not answer. I opened the folder and began reviewing the statements. Accounts receivable aging beyond 90 days. Overextended client discounts. A new lease on a larger office space signed in August, 3 months ago. Expansion without secure contracts. I tapped the lease page. "Explain this." "We needed room to grow. You needed confirmed revenue. It was coming." "Based on what?" He hesitated. "Verbal commitments." I closed the folder slowly. "This is why structure matters," I said. "You mistake projection for guarantee. And you mistake caution for wisdom." He shot back, though without heat. "Perhaps," I conceded, "but my caution paid for that house." The room fell silent. That was the first time I had referenced the house directly. He swallowed. "You're to take it, aren't you?" The promissory note allows acceleration upon material breach. So yes. Acceleration is not eviction, I clarified. It is demand for repayment. "You know I can't repay it." "I know." He rubbed his temples. "This is insane." "No," I said softly. "This is predictable." The next week, the bank issued a formal notice of covenant breach, 30 days to cure. Without my reaffirmation, the facility would convert to term loan status with increased interest. He called less frequently now. Pride wars with necessity before surrendering. On November 22nd, Hawthorne Preparatory sent a second tuition reminder, this one addressed directly to him. I did not intervene. At dinner weeks earlier, he had sought applause by diminishing me. He believed history was pliable, that identity could be reframed through humor. Now, Documentation reframed him. The children noticed a shift before he admitted it. My granddaughter asked him why the school portal showed a balance due. Children sense instability the way animals sense weather changes. He told her it was a clerical delay. Perhaps it was. Clerical actions were, after all, driving the sequence. On November 30th, he requested a meeting, not at his house, not at mine, neutral ground, a quiet restaurant with linen tablecloths and restrained lighting, the same type of place he had once described as pretentious. When he arrived, he did not order wine. "I need to understand what you want," he said after we sat. "I want accuracy," I replied. "In what form?" "In acknowledgement." He stared at the tablecloth for a long moment. "I was wrong," he said finally. "Reinstatement was not immediate. Apologies, even sincere ones, do not automatically repair structure. They open the door to renegotiation. Nothing more." When he said he had been wrong, I did not contradict him. I did not soften. I simply nodded and asked for specifics. Precision matters. Vague remorse dissolves under pressure. Specific acknowledgement holds shape. "You implied I lacked instincts," I said calmly. "Yet your firm expanded into larger overhead without secured contracts. Explain the discrepancy." He exhaled slowly. "I thought growth would attract stability." "And did it?" "No." He did not look at me when he answered. "And the house?" I continued. "You described my contribution as insignificant." He closed his eyes briefly. "It wasn't insignificant. It was $280,000. "I know." "Say it." He looked up. "The house exists because you transferred the down payment." "Yes." There was no triumph in forcing him to articulate it, only calibration. Reality must be spoken aloud before it can be absorbed. The restaurant was quiet around us. Polished silverware. Low conversation from nearby tables. The contrast was deliberate. At dinner weeks earlier, warmth and noise had amplified humiliation. Here, controlled lighting and restrained voices emphasized clarity. "I don't want your firm to collapse," I said finally. "Nor do I want your children removed from school. But neither will I continue underwriting arrogance." He winced slightly at that word. "I wasn't arrogant," he murmured. "You were careless," I corrected. The distinction landed more deeply. For the next 40 minutes, we reviewed terms, not emotionally but procedurally. The trust suspension would remain in place until he completed a full financial disclosure of the firm, including signed statements and a written corrective plan for covenant compliance. The credit guarantee would not be reaffirmed automatically. Instead, it would convert to conditional support tied to quarterly performance thresholds. The promissory note on the house would not be accelerated, but repayment terms would be clarified in writing. "You're restructuring your own son," he said quietly. "I am restructuring exposure." He leaned back, hands folded, absorbing the language. There was no audience here, no guest to impress, no children watching, only documentation and consequence. "You always talk like this," he said. "Yes." "It's exhausting. It is stabilizing." He almost smiled at that, though faintly. When the check arrived, I paid it without hesitation. Another small gesture. Control is not loud. The following week, he delivered the financial disclosures. This time organized, tabbed, signed. The lease for the larger office had been renegotiated, sublet partially to reduce overhead. 2 outstanding client receivables were formally documented with enforceable timelines. It was not perfection, but it was discipline. On December 8th at 3:16 p.m., I authorized partial reinstatement of the tuition disbursement, not the full amount, 70%. The remaining balance will be contingent upon compliance review at the end of the quarter. He called that evening. "They processed it," he said. "Yes." "Thank you." "You're welcome." There was a pause. "I told the kids," he added. "Told them what?" "That Grandpa worked in structured finance, that you built things carefully, that I was wrong to joke." I did not respond immediately. "And," I prompted gently, "and that stability doesn't happen by accident." That mattered more than any bank covenant. Over the next month, the firm stabilized marginally. Payroll resumed consistency. The bank's tone softened. Compliance was still under watch, but not in breach. But something else shifted too. He visited more frequently, not to argue, not to demand, but to ask questions about risk, about debt structuring, about why I insisted on documentation. The conversations were cautious at first. Pride lingers even after apology, but curiosity began replacing defensiveness. One afternoon, while reviewing a draft contract he had brought over, he paused mid-sentence. "Why didn't you just yell at me that night?" he asked. I looked up from the page. "Because yelling does not correct trajectory. And this does. This reveals it." He considered that. "You let me fail a little." I removed insulation. There was again the word that defined the entire arc. Failure, when buffered by invisible support, masquerades as competence. Remove the buffer and truth surfaces. In late December, Hawthorne Preparatory sent a holiday newsletter. My granddaughter had written a short essay about responsibility. She described how her father was learning how to check numbers carefully and how her grandfather likes contracts because they protect people from confusion. I read the sentence twice. Protect people from confusion. Children reduce complexity into clarity adults often avoid. On January 3rd, the bank formally lifted the covenant breach notice. Conditional guarantee reinstated under modified terms. I signed the amendment without ceremony. That evening, my son invited me to dinner again. Same dining room, same table, but the atmosphere was different. No boasting, no performance. The children greeted me at the door. He walked me in himself. During the meal, my grandson asked again what I used to do for work. My son answered this time. Grandpa made sure agreements meant something, he said evenly. I watched his face as he spoke. There was no sarcasm, no edge. He's the reason this house exists, he added quietly. The room was silent for a brief moment, not awkward, just recalibrated. I placed my fork down again, but this time not in restraint, in acknowledgement. Consequence had not destroyed him. It had corrected him. Later that evening, as I stood on the porch preparing to leave, he stepped outside with me. I thought success meant independence, he said. It does, I replied. Then why did I feel so exposed when you pulled back? Because independence built on invisible support is dependence. He absorbed that without argument. The air was cold again, as it had been the night I left weeks earlier, but the temperature felt different, less sharp, less hostile. He had called me a failure in front of his children. What he learned instead was that stability is rarely loud. It is structured, it is documented, it is deliberate, and when it withdraws, even briefly, it reveals who truly understands the weight of consequence. January settled in quietly. Cold mornings, frost on the edges of the lawn, the kind of stillness that exposes small sounds, doors closing, heaters cycling on, distant traffic before sunrise. Stability had returned, but not fully. Stability never returns in its original form once it has been tested. It comes back altered, measured. My son's firm survived the quarter, but just barely. Revenue stabilized at a level lower than his earlier projections. 2 clients renewed under stricter terms. 1 terminated entirely. The lease reduction helped, but margins were thin. The illusion of effortless growth had evaporated. What remained was work, real work. On January 17th at 8:12 a.m., he emailed me a revised 3-year projection model, not inflated, not optimistic, conservative, sensible. He had added a contingency column labeled buffer. I noticed it immediately. I did not respond right away. I printed the document, annotated in pen, and returned it with 3 questions about cash flow timing and receivable aging. He replied within an hour, clarified without defensiveness. That was new. Discipline is not taught through lectures. It is absorbed through exposure. Later that week, I received a letter from Hawthorne Preparatory confirming full tuition satisfaction for the term. I had authorized the remaining 30% after compliance review cleared. I did not announce it. I simply processed it. He called that evening. They said everything's current, he said. Yes. I didn't ask you to release the rest. I know. There was a pause. Not tense. Reflective. I've been covering more myself, he added quietly. That is appropriate. He did not argue. In early February, he invited me to his office, not for crisis, not for confrontation, for advice. The space looked smaller than before, though nothing physical had changed. Perhaps perspective alters dimension. The oversized conference table that once symbolized ambition now felt slightly excessive for the remaining staff, but the atmosphere was calmer, less inflated. I'm restructuring compensation, he said, handing me a draft memo. Lower base, performance-tied bonus. No more aggressive expansion until cash reserves hit 6 months of payroll. I read it slowly. The language was sober. No grand claims. No projections beyond reason. This is sustainable, I said. He nodded. I should have done it earlier. Yes. He leaned against the edge of the desk. When you pull back, I thought you were trying to humiliate me. I was trying to reveal exposure. I felt exposed. That was the point. He absorbed that without flinching. Outside the office window, the city moved normally. People walking, cars passing. No one aware that an internal recalibration had taken place within these walls. Consequence rarely makes headlines. It alters quietly. A week later, he came to my house for dinner. No guests, no audience, just the two of us. I cooked something simple. Roast chicken, potatoes, water poured into plain glasses. The lighting was warm but subdued. The environment mirrored that first night, but inverted. No performance, no commentary. Midway through the meal, he set his fork down, not carefully as I had done months earlier, but deliberately enough to signal intention. I've been thinking about what I said, he began. I waited. I wasn't just joking, he admitted. Part of me believed it. Believed what? That you didn't take enough risks, that you played it safe, that you could have been bigger. Bigger? More visible, more impressive. And you equate visibility with success? He hesitated. I used to. And now I see that invisible stability is harder. The words were not rehearsed. They carried weight. You built insulation for me, he continued, and I treated it like entitlement. Yes. He nodded slowly. When it went away, even partially, I realized how much of my confidence was borrowed. Borrowed. That word mattered. Confidence derived from external guarantees is fragile. Remove the guarantee and self-perception trembles. I don't want borrowed confidence anymore, he said. Then earn it, I replied. He did not look offended, only thoughtful. Weeks passed without incident. Payroll remained steady. The bank reduced monitoring frequency. The tuition portal showed no outstanding balances. Then something unexpected occurred. On March 2nd, at 6:40 p.m., my granddaughter presented a school project on what I want to be when I grow up. My son sent me a photo. She had written that she wanted to help people make good agreements so no one gets confused. I stared at the message longer than necessary. Children internalize more than we think. The narrative had corrected itself, but correction does not erase memory. One evening in mid-March, as winter softened into early spring, he asked me directly, "Were you ever going to take the house?" I considered the question carefully. If you had continued disregarding structure, I said, yes. He nodded slowly. You would have accelerated the note. Yes, and if I couldn't pay, the bank would have stepped in. He inhaled sharply at the clarity. You really would have let that happen. I would have allowed consequence to proceed. He stared at the floor for a moment. I thought you were bluffing. I do not bluff. He knew that now. The difference between anger and inevitability is discipline. By April, the firm had rebuilt modest reserves, not dramatic growth, not headlines. Stability, real stability, the kind that does not require applause. One Sunday afternoon, nearly 6 months after the original dinner, we gathered again at his house. Same dining room, same table. But this time, when his son asked about business, my son answered cautiously. We're learning to build carefully, he said. Grandpa says slow money is strong money. I had never used that exact phrase, but the meaning was correct. Later, as dishes were cleared, he approached me quietly. I used to think strength meant independence from you, he said. Now I think it means being able to stand without leaning on you. Yes, and I'm getting there. You are. The warmth in the room felt different from the first dinner. No edge, no performance, just presence. He had called me a failure in front of his children. What he had exposed instead was his own misunderstanding of structure. What followed was not revenge. It was recalibration. Consequence did not destroy him. It disciplined him. And discipline, when accepted rather than resisted, becomes inheritance far more valuable than money. Spring did not arrive dramatically. It unfolded in increments. Longer daylight, milder air, the quiet return of routine without crisis. That was the true test. Not whether he could survive consequence, but whether he could sustain correction once urgency faded. In late April, I received something I had not requested. A wire transfer. $17,500. Reference line, partial repayment, April. I stared at the confirmation longer than I expected to. The promissory note on the house did not require installment payments yet. Acceleration had never been formally triggered. There was no legal obligation for him to begin reducing principal. He called an hour later. I sent something, he said. Yes, I want the note to shrink. Why? Because I don't like owing you. That discomfort is healthy. I know. There was no sarcasm in his tone, no resentment, just quiet resolve. Repayment alters psychology. When money flows one direction only, hierarchy distorts. When it flows back, even partially, balance begins to restore. In May, he revised his firm's operating model again. This time, not in reaction to crisis, but preemptively. He downsized office space further, transitioned part of the team to remote, built reserves equal to 4 months of payroll. Not 6 yet, but moving. He sent me the revised model before implementing it, not for permission, for perspective. I returned it with marginal notes and one sentence written at the bottom. Margin protects dignity. He framed that sentence and placed it on the wall behind his desk. I saw it during my next visit. I did not comment on it. Confidence was changing in him. It was less loud, less performative, more contained. One evening in early June, he came to my house unannounced again, but the posture was different from the October confrontation. He stood on the porch holding a folder. Not tense, not defensive. I need you to review something, he said when I opened the door. Inside the folder was a new partnership agreement, a smaller venture, conservative capital requirements. No guarantee requested from me. No co-signature. I want to do this without your backing, he said. Why? Because if it works, I want to be mine. And if it fails on me. That answer mattered more than the numbers on the page. We reviewed the contract line by line. I corrected phrasing, tightened liability language, suggested contingency triggers. He listened carefully, asked questions, wrote notes. At one point, he paused. Why didn't you teach me this earlier? He asked. I tried. You never forced it. I believed experience would teach faster than lectures. He gave a faint smile. It did. Summer approached. The children finished the school year successfully. Tuition for next term was discussed openly this time, not assumed. He contributed nearly half without prompting. The trust covered the remainder under reinstated discretionary terms. Balance was forming. In July, something small but telling occurred. At a family barbecue hosted by his neighbor, someone asked casually what I had done before retiring. The question hovered in the air, similar to the 1 month earlier. My son answered before I could. He built the financial backbone of 3 mid-sized firms and structured contracts that still protect people today, he said evenly. No exaggeration, no overcorrection, just fact. Then he added, and he taught me the difference between projection and guarantee. The neighbor nodded politely, unaware of the weight behind the statement. Later that evening, as dusk settled and conversation drifted, he stepped beside me near the edge of the yard. I thought success meant impressing people, he said quietly. It does not, I replied. I embarrassed you because I was insecure. Yes. He did not flinch from the confirmation. I wanted the kids to think I built everything myself. And now, I want them to understand how structure works. That was a shift. Structure is not glamorous. It is rarely visible. It does not generate applause, but it sustains. By late August, the new partnership he launched independently began generating modest but steady income, not dramatic returns, but clean, transparent, profitable within projection. He brought the first quarterly statement to my house. I didn't need your guarantee, he said. No, but I needed your discipline. Yes, there was no resentment in his voice when he said it, only acknowledgement. We sat in my study, the same room where the first review began months earlier. The desk lamp cast familiar light across documents now less threatening. The air felt lighter. I keep replaying that dinner, he admitted after a while. As you should. I was trying to feel bigger. You felt smaller. He nodded slowly. I don't want my kids to learn that version of me. They won't, I said, if you continue this path. Redemption is not a moment. It is repetition. By September, nearly a year from the original insult, the promissory note principal had decreased by almost 20% through voluntary payments. The firm maintained 6 months of reserves. The bank downgraded oversight to standard monitoring. Tuition for the new term was split almost evenly between his contributions and the trust. He was standing without leaning. One evening in early October, the anniversary of that dinner, he invited me over again. Same table, same room, but no tension. Midway through the meal, he paused, glanced at his children, then looked at me. A year ago, he said, voice steady, I said something careless at this table. The room went quiet. I was wrong, he continued, and I learned more from what followed than from anything before. The children watched him carefully. I hope you remember that stability takes discipline, he said to them, and that you never diminish someone who helped you build it. I did not respond immediately. I simply nodded once. The arc had come full circle, not through anger, not through humiliation, but through structured consequence. He had called me a failure in front of his children. What he became instead was a man who understood that independence without integrity collapses, and that dignity, once tested, either fractures or hardens into something stronger than pride. The following winter was quieter than the last. There were no compliance notices, no emergency phone calls, no tuition suspensions. The absence of crisis can feel unfamiliar after months of recalibration. Stability, when earned, is almost anticlimactic. But true transformation reveals itself not in moments of pressure, but in patterns of behavior. In December, my son hosted a year-end dinner for his firm. Smaller venue this time, modest restaurant. No grand speeches about expansion or industry disruption. Just a review of steady growth, disciplined budgeting, and retained earnings. He invited me. I accepted. When I entered a private dining room, he stood and introduced me to his employees, not as guarantor, not as investor, but as the man who taught me that contracts are promises to your future self. It was not rehearsed. It was not dramatic. It was accurate. I watched the staff's reaction carefully. There was respect in their posture, not because of wealth, because of clarity. Later that evening, as coffee was poured and conversation loosened, one of the junior analysts asked him how the firm survived last year's downturn. He did not hesitate. We nearly didn't, he said plainly. I mistook growth for strength. I relied on guarantees instead of building reserves. I learned the difference. The admission was public, measured, and unforced. That mattered. Humility is rarely visible in the moment of collapse. It is visible in how collapse is described afterward. After the dinner, as coats were gathered and goodbyes exchanged, he walked beside me to the parking lot. I wanted them to hear it from me, he said. They did. I don't feel exposed anymore when I say it. That is because it is no longer denial. The air was cold again, much like the night months earlier when he had come to my house demanding tuition reinstatement. But this cold carried no hostility, just clarity. By early January, the final voluntary payment on the promissory note reduced the balance below 50% of the original principal. He sent each transfer without commentary. No performative declaration. Just reference lines that read, installment January, installment February. He no longer avoided the language of debt. One afternoon in February, he asked me something unexpected. Did you ever think I wouldn't correct? Yes, I answered honestly. He absorbed that without defensiveness. And what would you have done? I would have accelerated the note, withdrawn the guarantee permanently, allowed consequence to proceed. He nodded slowly. You would have let me lose the house. Yes. He looked out the window for a long moment. I think that's when I realized you weren't punishing me. You were willing to lose something too. He was correct. Consequence does not discriminate. It extracts from all parties involved. I would have regretted the loss, I said quietly, but I would not have regretted the boundary. He did not respond immediately. I used to think boundaries were cold, he said finally. They are protective. Of you, of structure. He considered that. In March, his new partnership completed its first full fiscal year in profit. Small profit, but clean. He invited me to review the audited statement. Not because he needed approval, but because he wanted to share it. I didn't overextend, he said. I didn't assume anything would be there unless it was written. And how does that feel? Stable. There was again the word that had replaced big and impressive. Stable. In April, the anniversary of the down payment transfer, he did something I had not anticipated. He refinanced the remaining balance on the house in his own name, without my guarantee, and wired the full outstanding principal to my account. The transfer arrived at 11:37 a.m. Reference line, final repayment, thank you. He called shortly afterward. It's done, he said. Yes. I didn't want that note lingering. You could have continued installments. I know, but I didn't want borrowed equity. Borrowed equity. The phrase was precise. Mature. That was wise. I said, I wanted the house to feel like mine. And now it does. There was no celebration, no applause, just the quiet closing of an obligation. That evening, he came to my house again. No folder, no documents, just conversation. I think about that dinner sometimes, he admitted. As you should. I was trying to elevate myself by lowering you. Yes, and it backfired. No, I corrected gently. It revealed you. He accepted that. Do you forgive me? He asked. Forgiveness is not theatrical. It is structural like everything else. I corrected you. I said, I did not carry resentment. He exhaled slowly. I'm glad you didn't yell. I do not yell. He smiled faintly. I know. The following Sunday, at a small family gathering, my grandson asked him directly, Did Grandpa really help you with the house? He answered without hesitation, Yes, and I paid him back. The child nodded, satisfied. There was no embarrassment in the statement, no defensiveness, just fact. Later that evening, as I drove home, I reflected on the arc quietly. He had called me a failure in front of his children. What followed was not revenge, not humiliation, not dominance. It was exposure. Exposure led to discipline. Discipline led to stability, and stability restored dignity, not just mine, but his. True correction is rarely explosive. It is iterative, quiet, unavoidable. The insulation had been removed. He had learned to build his own. There's a peculiar quiet that follows repayment. When the final wire arrived and the promissory note was stamped satisfied, something intangible shifted between us. Not distance, not closeness, balance. Debt, even when friendly, carries weight. It bends posture subtly. It alters tone. Once removed, conversation straightens. The house was as now, fully, cleanly, without annotation. The trust remained for the children, but its discretionary nature was no longer misunderstood. The credit guarantee had long since been released. The firm operated within its means. The partnership he launched independently stabilized into consistent profit. Externally, nothing dramatic had changed. The house looked the same. The dining room table had not moved. The children still ran through the hallway laughing. But internally, alignment had returned. In late May, nearly 18 months after that first dinner. He asked if I would speak to a small group of young entrepreneurs he was mentoring. Not about success, about contracts. I want them to hear what I didn't understand, he said. I agreed. The event was held in a modest conference room. No stage lighting, no grand introduction. He stood beside me as he opened the session. When I started my firm, he said plainly, I thought vision was enough. I thought confidence filled gaps. I was wrong. Contracts don't limit you. They reveal where you're exposed. He did not mention the dinner. He did not need to. When it was my turn, I spoke quietly about margin, about documentation, about how generosity without structure erodes clarity. I did not frame it as a cautionary tale. I framed it as architecture. Afterward, one of the attendees approached my son and said, "You're lucky to have that kind of support." He answered calmly, and I learned not to take it for granted. The phrasing was important, was support that becomes invisible invites distortion. Support acknowledged remains intact. That evening, as we drove separately home, I considered something I had not allowed myself to examine fully before. I had been tested as well. It is easy to enforce boundaries with strangers. It is harder with family. Love tempts compromise. Pride tempts retaliation. Silence tempts endurance without correction. I had chosen structure instead, not because I enjoyed control, not because I needed vindication, but because dignity erodes when tolerated disrespect becomes normalized. Months later, during another family dinner, the moment mirrored the original one almost exactly. Same warm lighting, same table arrangement, the children older now, taller, voices slightly deeper. Midway through the meal, my youngest grandson asked his father, "Were you always good at business?" The room paused. This was the axis again, the moment where narrative forms. My son smiled, not arrogantly, not defensively. "No," he said, "I had to learn the hard way." "How?" the boy pressed. "I confused being loud with being strong," he replied, "and Grandpa showed me the difference." There was no discomfort in the room, no tension, just clarity. Later that night, after the children went upstairs, he and I stood alone in the kitchen. "I'm glad you didn't protect me from consequence," he said. "I did protect you," I replied. He frowned slightly. "I protected you from becoming someone smaller." The words settled between us. Failure, as he once defined it, had meant visibility without applause, caution without glamour, structure without spectacle. Now he understood something different. Failure would have been allowing arrogance to calcify, allowing entitlement to become identity, allowing children to absorb a distorted definition of strength. He had called me a failure in front of his kids. But what he truly feared then was comparison. My discipline contrasted his projection. My steadiness exposed his volatility. Instead of learning from it, he tried to diminish it. When that strategy collapsed, he faced himself, and he chose correction. In September of the second year after that dinner, he sent me something unexpected. Not a wire transfer, not a financial report, a handwritten letter. It was brief. He wrote that the worst part of that evening had not been the tuition suspension or the bank pressure. It had been realizing that his children saw him diminish someone who had helped him. That image lingered longer than any financial strain. "I never want them to see me like that again," he wrote. That sentence mattered more than any repayment. Years from now, the house will likely be renovated. The firm may expand or contract. Markets will fluctuate. Guarantees will be replaced with new agreements. But the lesson will remain embedded. Structure over spectacle. Margin over momentum. Documentation over assumption. And above all, dignity over performance. The final time we revisited that original moment directly was quiet. We were sitting in my study, the same room where I first opened the promissory note months earlier. The lamp cast the same steady light across the desk. "You could have destroyed me," he said calmly. "No," I corrected. "You were capable of destroying yourself, and you let me see that." "Yes." He nodded once. "I'm grateful." Gratitude delivered without theatrics carries weight. He had called me a failure in front of his children. What he learned instead was that strength is not measured by applause or expansion, but by discipline maintained when no one is watching. The insulation had been removed. He built his own, and in doing so, he inherited something far more durable than money, the understanding that consequence is not cruelty. It is correction when delivered with restraint. The arc had completed itself, not with shouting, not with humiliation, but with structure, clarity, and the quiet restoration of respect.